Greetings. Welcome to the deVeber Institute's first virtual lecture. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We've held lectures in universities, in libraries, and even in pubs. And this is the first time we've been invited into your home. Thank you very, very much. These are unusual times, and this is our first venture to reach out and be available to anyone anywhere in Canada to join us for this lecture tonight, which will have 4 presentations. They will be concise and very interesting and very diverse. I am so glad that you are joining us tonight. We will be having Dr. Jane Pritchard as our featured speaker. She is a family physician in Toronto. We will be having Bob Parke, a bioethicist, and a very exciting venture that he is working with others to begin. And then we will be having 2 presentations that are based on the research carried out by our summer interns this year. Our summer interns are Brianna Tashick and Mathe. And the 2 presenters tonight will be Brianna herself and Zoe Stewart-Bedard, the current executive assistant to the board, who will be giving us a summary of Mathe's research, as Catherine is not available tonight to give it. So I welcome each and every one of you, and I'm so glad that we will be able to share this view of research on really significant human life questions. Thank you. So our first speaker tonight is Brianna Tashick. The deVeber Institute has published 2 significantly lengthy and detailed books recently. One is Complications, and the full title for Complications is Abortion's Impact on Women. The second book that we have published lately is It's Not That Simple, Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide in Canada. Brianna's research focused on 2 of the sections in Complications, specifically dealing with gender-based abortion and also on women's mortality. So her research was bringing up to date these subject areas that are covered in Complications. And Brianna is presently finishing her teaching degree at the University of Windsor, and she's a graduate of her BA studies at Western University in Ontario. Brianna, thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you for that kind introduction, Martha. All right, I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. All right. So hello and welcome everybody. As Martha said, my name's Brianna Tashick, and I have a degree in English language and literature and creative writing from University of Western Ontario, and I'm currently in my final year of Teachers College. So I was one of the summer research associates for the deVeber Institute. I worked under the supervision of Ian Gentles to gather information on sex selection abortion, and I also investigated the claim that abortion lowers maternal mortality. So let's look at the context of sex selection abortion and women's issues in China and India. So sex ratio at birth in China and India. So a normal sex ratio at birth, or SRB, is approximately 105 males per 100 females. In 2019, the estimated SRB in China was 113 boys per 100 girls. While this is still a drop from its peak in 2005, this is more than it was in 2017. In 2016, the SRB for India was 877 females for every 1,000 males. So this means that in 2016, there were 12.3% less females being born per 1,000 than males. So moving over to China and the impact of the 1 and 2 child policies. In 2019, there have been almost 400 million reported abortions performed in China since the advent of the one-child policy. Sex-selective abortion of females is a huge problem in China due to traditional son preference. This has only been aggravated by the one- and two-child policies. While government programs such as the All China Women's Federation for Nanchuan had been encouraging and even forcing women to have abortions for years, these organizations have shifted to urging women to have 2 children. However, the changing economy, the normalization of abortion in single-child households, and societal pressure on parents to pay thousands for extra classes and tools to help their children succeed has resulted in a continuing aging crisis. It is projected that 17.1% of the population of China will be over 65 by 2030. Between now and 2028, it is predicted that there will be a 40% decrease, which is nearly half, in the number of Chinese women between the ages of 23 and 30, and only 8 million total births per year. In 2019, births dropped to just 14.6 million, which is the lowest number recorded in a single year since 1961. So we'll look at women's health in India. In 2017, for children ages 1 to 4 in India, it was found that disease-related deaths were higher for girls. Natural factors alone could not account for this. Data suggests that attitudes about women and girls have led to poor health outcomes for females. They are less likely to be breastfed by their mothers, are given poorer diets than their male counterparts, are less likely to be given medical treatment, and there's evidence of mothers taking better care of themselves overall when they know they are pregnant with a boy. In 2017, the female to male mortality for children ages 0 to 4 was higher for females than males, meaning that females were more likely to die in early childhood than males. So for cultural attitudes in Vietnam and India, Hang notes that in studying trends in Vietnam, government bans against sex-selective practices have been difficult to enforce, as it is easy for parents to lie about why they want to have an abortion. And a 2017 CNN article further proves that simply banning sex selection abortion does not work without strict, consistent enforcement and government and social efforts to change cultural attitudes. So this article details the operation of a group of female activists who go undercover at hospitals and clinics in India to prove how widespread sex selection is still practiced and to have doctors who engage in such practices arrested. One thing that has caused sex selection abortion to continue in India is the fact that although dowry payments were outlawed in India in 1961, they still persist in certain areas. This results in females having a lower status than males because they are costing their parents money. So this perpetuates son preference that leads to more sex selection abortion. And widespread sex selection abortion has led to India's highly skewed sex ratio at birth. So the net reproductive rate, or NRR, is the number of surviving daughters per woman. In China, the current number of 0.796 is less than needed to replace the female population. This number is not predicted to reach replacement rate this century. Canada's projections for 2095 to 2100 are even worse than China's, with an expected NRR of just 0.83. Very few countries are expected to reach replacement rate by 2100. And while there are other factors, it can be assumed that sex selection abortion and abortion as a whole are contributing to this, especially in countries like Canada, where abortion is available on demand. So let's look at the number of missing women, a global perspective. So just to give some context for how I arrived at these numbers, as of 2018, according to Kumar and Sina, 1.8 million girls under the age of 5 go missing due to sex-selective practices every year. According to Bongars and Gayamoto, an estimated 126 million women and girls were missing in 2010, with an estimated rate of 1.8 million going missing every year due to excess deaths and an additional 1.7 million due to prenatal sex-selective practices. So if we add these two numbers together, that is a total of 3.5 million women and girls going missing every year. However, the 2012 World Development Report had an estimated 3.9 million women and girls under the age of 60 going missing every year due to sex selection practices and excess female mortality. So Klassen and Wink predict the number of missing women in absolute terms in 2002 was somewhere between 65 and 110 million. So if we take the 2002 estimate from Klassen and Wink and the lower estimate of an additional 3.5 million going missing every year, then by 2010, there would have been between 127,500,000 and 131 million missing women, which fits roughly with Bongars and Gayamoto's estimate. On the higher end, if we take the estimate of 3.9 million provided by the 2012 World Development Report and apply it to Klassen and Wink's 2002 estimate, the number of missing women in 2010 would have been roughly between 129,900,000 and 133,400,000. This would mean that in 2020, there would be somewhere between 161 million and 172,400,000 estimated missing women. However, it's possible that this number is much higher, as instances of female abandonment, infanticide, and sex selection are likely underreported to avoid violating laws against these practices. So switching over now into maternal mortality. So we're going to look at the example of Chile, which has very restrictive abortion laws and also low maternal mortality. So in 2017, Chile's maternal mortality, or MMR, was less than the USA, with the former having 13 deaths per 100 live births and the latter having 19. So this is a slight continued decrease from 2009 on, despite the fact that in 2017, the already restrictive abortion laws in Chile became even more restricted with the expansion of conscientious objection rights to include entire private healthcare institutions. Further, it is still very difficult to get an abortion in Chile due to lack of knowledge of the law, private clinics insisting on showing women their ultrasounds, and lots of documentation required to be transferred to a hospital that will perform the procedure. Despite this, in 2017, Chile was in the top 12 for the lowest MMR in the world if we're counting the number of deaths. So moving over to South Africa now. While the abortion law in South Africa is very liberal, it is still difficult to obtain an abortion due to lack of information and low socioeconomic status. Further, many doctors invoke conscientious objection rights due to stigma and overwork. Because of this, there are still many illegal abortions that happen. And after the legalization of abortion in 1996, the maternal mortality in South Africa rose sharply, peaking from 2005 to 2006 with 201 deaths per 100,000 live births. However, in 2007 through the 2010s, it began to decline, being 119 deaths per 100,000 live births in 2017. So clearly abortion cannot explain the sudden decline in MMR in South Africa. So we have to ask ourselves what changed in 2007. One answer is that this is when the South African government's ART program, which was created to combat the HIV/AIDS epidemic, began to see results. Its effects started to be seen in 2007 with a continuous decline in HIV/AIDS-related deaths. This correlates to when the decline in the MMR started after its peak in 2005 to 06. So finally, we're going to turn to Poland. Poland has one of the strictest abortion laws in Europe. Abortion is only legal in cases of rape, incest, serious malformation of the fetus, and if the pregnancy poses a serious health risk to the mother, as attested to by 2 physicians. In 2017, there was a credible movement to ban abortion altogether in Poland that made it all the way to the Polish parliament before ultimately being struck down. Recently, Poland has proposed another bill, which, if passed, would outlaw abortion in the case of severe and/or fatal fetal impairment. Despite this, Poland has a lower maternal mortality than Canada, which has abortion on demand. In fact, it is tied with Belarus, Italy, and Norway for the lowest maternal mortality in the world, having just 2 deaths per 100,000 live births. So for some concluding thoughts, one thing that was consistent throughout all of my research was the negative impact of abortion on women. Son preference in China and India have resulted in the deaths of millions of preborn girls and a mistreatment of women across the board. The one-child policy in China has resulted in a huge shortage of women and girls, as son preference there still persists. In India, the impact of dowries and son preference has resulted in an increase in sex-selective abortion and the continued mistreatment of women. There are over 100 million missing women and girls worldwide today. Abortion does not have the positive impact on women's health that its proponents complain, as demonstrated by the countries that I mentioned. But what it does do, however, is ensure that there are less women in the world than there should be. So thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Brianna. Thank you also for your very reflective ending that helped put into perspective what we learned from this research. And it made me think of Feminists for Life expression that says women deserve better than abortion. And I think to speak up for women's rights and to have this research to bolster that is very helpful for all of us. Thank you for your work and for your passion in presenting it tonight. Thank you very much. The next summer intern who we had the pleasure of working with this year was Mathe. Mathe has her doctorate in political science, and her research was on end-of-life issues, particularly on issues related to assisted suicide or medical assistance in dying. And in particular, she worked on 2 aspects of that. One is, what's the impact of COVID-19 and assisted suicide? How are they meshing together? What the impact has been? And secondly, the federal government has been proposing Bill C7 to amend, to expand the provision of assisted suicide in Canada. Mathe, we thank you very much for your research in this area. And our executive assistant to the board, Zoe Stewart-Bedard, will be presenting the research tonight in summary form because Mathe wasn't able to do it tonight. And we thank her again for her research. And Zoe, thank you for giving us the summary of that right now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. My presentation is going to be in 2 parts tonight. The first is going to focus on the correlation between MAiD, which is medical assistance in dying, and COVID-19. And the second portion is going to be about Bill C7. So I'm going to get the PowerPoint going and then we can start. All right. So I think we can all agree that seniors around the country have had their lives changed by restrictions designed to mitigate the COVID-19 spread. In June, the Canadian Institute for Health Information revealed that COVID-19 had taken the lives of over 5,000 residents of long-term care homes, and that's 81% of all lives lost in Canada due to the pandemic up to that point. This is a grim statistic, but, oh, it seems that my PowerPoint is not up. Okay, Well, I will keep going audio and try the PowerPoint again while I go. So even though that is a grim statistic, the fuller impact of the pandemic on these residents is a lot harder to quantify. It is mind-boggling to think about those who have remained free of the disease and may still be suffering greatly from the loneliness and isolation that the enhanced precautions from lockdowns and all the changes that have happened over the last couple months have brought on them. There is a great risk that this kind of suffering will lead many who were previously content with their lives to consider MAiD for the first time as a means to escape their current circumstances. The first annual report on MAiD was released in 2019, and it revealed that 13.9% of people who died of COVID, 13.7% of people who died by MAiD in 2019 described that the reason for their application was isolation or loneliness. And Canada's experience with the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to light the devastating and sometimes fatal conditions that many vulnerable Canadians face in long-term care homes. If Canada does not have a system in place to ensure that the conditions for those living in long-term care meet at least some acceptable standard, we're going to see a devastating spike in MAiD applications following this COVID pandemic. More light was shed on how COVID-19 is making euthanasia a more accessible option in a webinar hosted by the euthanasia advocacy group, Dying with Dignity, where several MAiD practitioners discussed their firsthand experience of providing MAiD during the pandemic. Shockingly, during this pandemic, when families and friends and volunteers have been shut out of long-term care homes, providers of MAiD are free to enter. And as one provider stated, I was allowed into every home. The federal statistics needed to demonstrate whether MAiD requests or deaths have risen due to the impact of COVID-19 will not be available until next year. This graph from Health Canada's annual report on MAiD from 2019 shows a steady increase in MAiD since legalization. From this graph, we can reasonably anticipate that a further increase can be expected, but the exact extent cannot be known until these statistics are made available. Given all of the current available evidence that isolation and economic restrictions and limits to medical access are driving up the number of MAiD requests, the need for greater detail is crucial now. It will be most unfortunate if the red flags are missed that might save lives today. And this need only becomes recognized retroactively when the pandemic's impact on MAiD has become too large to miss. Now we're going to move into the second portion of my presentation, which is focused on Bill C-7. Earlier this month, the federal government reintroduced Bill C-7, which had been left on the table when Parliament prorogued due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this bill was first introduced in February to vastly expand Canada's MAiD policies. In this part of the presentation, I'm going to briefly summarize the current laws concerning MAiD and the main changes that are being put forward in Bill C-7. In 2016, Canadian Parliament passed a bill that, in the most basic terms, allowed a medical professional to aid a person to die by suicide if certain qualifications were met. There are 4 criteria to be eligible, and they are that you must have a serious illness, be in an advanced state of decline, be experiencing suffering that is intolerable, and natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. Following a Quebec court ruling in 2019 that claimed that the current laws are unconstitutional due to the limitation that the individual must have a death that is reasonably foreseeable, the federal government crafted this Bill C-7 to broaden the MAiD laws. Bill C-7 proposes several changes, but we're just going to focus on 3 of the most significant ones. The first is MAiD for those who are not dying. Arguably, this is the biggest proposed change, and it would mean that a person who suffers from an irremediable medical condition could qualify for MAiD regardless of whether these conditions are expected to be fatal. Disability groups have strongly opposed this extension of MAiD eligibility. They explain that the role of the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement is to protect against disability being a reason to terminate life. Removing the qualification would allow a disability to serve as a justification potentially for ending a life. The second major change is made by advance consent. And this would be through a prior written arrangement for those whose death is reasonably foreseeable in certain circumstances. The government's readiness to take this particular step appears to be premised upon its belief that a person who is facing natural death and wants MAiD enough to proceed with the formal steps to secure it will not experience a change of heart about his or her decision. However, this confidence is in error, according to evidence that the government itself has provided in its first annual report on MAiD from 2019, where it states that 3.6% of the patients who made written requests for MAiD subsequently withdrew them. Now, I know that that is a small fraction, but it's not a small number of people. It ends up equaling over 260 Canadians that year alone who completed written requests for MAiD and then later chose not to go through with them. A parliamentary report discusses the potential societal costs of allowing advance requests, and some believe that advance requests could harm, and I quote, the way society values people with capacity loss, increasing the belief that it is acceptable to consider a life with capacity loss as one not worth living. Or even, quote, create a society in which MAiD was an appropriate alternative to providing quality and accessible care. The next proposed major change is that there will be no more waiting period. Under the current law, there is a mandatory 10-day period between the request and execution of MAiD. However, Bill C-7 proposes to remove this waiting period altogether. And this also, you can also pull on what we've just talked about with individuals then withdrawing their requests for MAiD. And it means that individuals who might have reconsidered, if given the time to reflect on their decision, may ultimately receive MAiD against their wishes. So what do we do now? What can we do to help if we feel so inclined? The federal government has until December 18th to pass the bill through the House of Commons and the Senate. If the proposed changes upset you and you want to be heard, the best course of action is to contact your local member of parliament or sign a petition against Bill C-7. If you want more information about Bill C-7 or about the correlation between MAiD requests and the COVID-19 pandemic, or if you'd like a copy of Catherine Mathe's research, please don't hesitate to contact the deVeber Institute. Thank you.
Very much, Zoe Stewart-Bedard and Catherine Mathe for the original research. One of the things that we always hear from those involved in palliative care, and we've had many presentations, the deVeber Institute over the years on palliative care, has been the small minority of Canadians that actually live in an area where palliative care is widely available or even available at all. And the dichotomy of providing assisted suicide nationwide, including even in prisons and long-term care facilities when no one else was allowed in, and not having palliative care available coast to coast to coast, is something that has long concerned certainly palliative care advocates and practitioners, but really all of us may be in the position of needing palliative care at some time. And it is, I think, bears repeating that if palliative care is widely available, fear of end of life difficulties are often abated, and a more peaceful resolution can be followed up than is the case with assisted suicide. So thank you very, very much, Zoe Stewart-Bedard, for that presentation. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jane Pritchard. Dr. Jane Pritchard has long been a supporter of the deVeber Institute and is a very busy family physician in Toronto. And she has a very special caseload with people who are refugees and those who are dealing with homelessness. And we are greatly honored to have Jane speak to us today about what she has learned from her practice of late during COVID-19. Thanks, Dr. Jane Pritchard.
Thank you, Martha, and hello, everyone. A little about myself and my journey as a family physician relevant to the stories and musings you are going to hear from me. In the stories, by the way, I have not used people's actual names to protect their identity. I have always found myself getting caught up in the lives of my patients and in the current events that shape them. I lived for a time in Australia. I worked in a Sydney emergency room, and I remember clearly telling myself after a frustrating string of encounters with addicted patients, I will never work with addicts. It was always one step forward, two steps back, it seemed to my youthful self. And often the step forward was lost in an inebriated haze, unrecalled. My husband and I and our 2-year-old son went to Bangladesh in the early 1980s to work, and I encountered crushing poverty and the injustices that perpetuate it. One pair of rubber thongs to a family worn by the breadwinner who toiled in the fields or pulled a rickshaw, the girls all anemic and dizzy from hookworm that entered via their bare feet. I came to Toronto in 1987, and here I stayed. I started working with Latin American refugees streaming in from the civil wars in Guatemala, El Salvador, and later Colombia. At the same time, I joined in the downtown practice of my colleague on site at a gritty drop-in center for homeless women who over time became housed and sometimes brought their male partners along. In 1991, crack cocaine hit Toronto in force, and our women spun out of control under its thrall. The older women were terrified by the young ones who were hyperkinetic and violent. Those young ones who survived are now old before their time, racked with physical and emotional pain from those times. After I'd been there 5 years, they started telling me their stories. And I had to re-examine my prejudices against the addicted. When they weren't spaced out or high, they recounted terrible tales of abuse from a tender age, in snatches that were hard to piece together. Under the hardened exterior, the wounded child lashing out at others and at herself. I came to understand that these women and men were severely traumatized at an early age, abused, neglected, used, till adolescence and freedom arrived with a measure of power. Many of these people have been my patients for 20 or 30 years, and I count it a privilege to know them. As for the refugees now well settled, I have often looked after their children and even grandchildren. Those from the street are generally cut off from their natural families. Some got housing, some live in shelters, some go from couch to couch, and some stay out all year. Onto this scene of unequal resources came COVID-19. Louisa is a hardworking woman in her 40s, a single mother. I have always gone out to work to help my family, she says with pride. I wasn't ever a person who went to parties. This spring, she came down with a cough, then fever and chest pain. It was COVID. She was pretty sick, febrile, short of breath, but stayed home and slowly got better. She told me she was really worried about her son, Jose. He was homeless and deeply into IV drugs. "He's lost his way," she said to me. She feared he would get COVID, and she asked him to come home. I knew she was afraid of him because he had tried to beat her up before. "I can't let him stay out there. He might die on his own or from COVID." It was scary for her having him around. He had a certain look in his eyes that chilled her. Around the same time, Marcy called me sobbing. Her 27-year-old intellectually disabled son, Tom, who was homeless, had appeared at her door and she couldn't turn him away. He had been living on the street and in shelters, heavily using crystal meth. He was violent and volatile. It took her a while to tell me that 2 nights before, she awoke to him trying to strangle her. "Just get him into a hospital so he can get treatment," she cried. She described that his paranoia had begun 4 years before, and he had started using fentanyl as a result. Although he had been in and out of jail many times, he had never, so far as she knew, had a psychiatric assessment. "If I turn him out, he'll go to a shelter and get into a fight and kill someone or get killed himself, or he'll get COVID and die. He doesn't know how to look after himself." She was making him soup and watching him devour whatever she set in front of him. Then he would fall asleep and twitch and scream at her. She refused to leave him. She was afraid he wouldn't wake up. I told her if he threatened her again, she needed to run out the front door, call 911, and charge him. We kept in touch by phone. Sometimes she couldn't say much because he was within earshot. He did try to strangle her again, and she did call 911 and charged him. And he spent a few weeks in jail. I don't know if he ever got a psych assessment. Fast forward 5 months, and Tom is back staying with his mom. I talked to her this morning. She said things were okay, but he was in the next room. Luisa called me and said Jose wanted help getting off drugs. He actually came to see me. This tall, serious young man told me he knew he couldn't do it on his own, and we made a plan that he would go to the local hospital's rapid access clinic the next week. I don't know if he went. The next week, when Luisa returned home from a medical appointment, she found him in his bedroom, lying dead on the floor. Where was help when these desperate mothers needed it? They were willing to risk their lives in order to protect their sons. Esperanza spent her last 16 months at home with metastatic cancer, tended to by her husband Carlos, her children and grandchildren, and her palliative team, much of this time during COVID. Afterwards, I was worried about Carlos. He never complains, and his daughter told me he was very withdrawn, not eating or sleeping. She called me after he had been coughing and febrile for a week. He did not want to go to hospital. He was short of breath on the phone. In the end, he took my advice and went to the ER. He was diagnosed with COVID pneumonia and started on antibiotics and oxygen, and was told he needed admission. He refused. He was adamant. He knew there could be no visitors if he was admitted. He told me, "I don't want to die alone." And he went home with home oxygen to his worried and grieving daughter. We stayed in touch by phone, and after a few days of getting worse, he turned a corner and started to feel well enough to eat and walk around. 2 weeks later, he's still on oxygen and slowly getting better. Let me tell you about Ethel, a lovely woman who is frail at the best of times. I suspect childhood malnutrition as she was orphaned early in life. Since being hit by a car over a year ago, she has struggled with headaches, dizziness and nausea, insomnia, and constant ringing in her ears. Then she developed an acute illness and required hospital admission, and finally, during COVID when it reopened, admission to rehab. This was going to be her chance to regain her strength while she was looked after. But she has very specific dietary requirements, and these could not be met in the hospital. A friend prepared for her a dish she knew she would eat, made from quinoa, and was turned back at the door. Neither she nor the meal could be allowed in. So Ethel lost weight, from about 40 kilograms to 37 kilograms while in hospital, and was often too weak and dizzy to participate in therapy. She is now home, and her friends are preparing her food, and she is eating again and starting to feel better. And she is going for outpatient physiotherapy, despite the COVID risk of travel. I'm a firm believer in the science that drives our public health response to a dangerous novel coronavirus threatening the entire world. I wake up and check the COVID rates in Toronto and Ontario and Bangladesh and other places I'm interested in. Socially, my husband and I have been self-isolating since March, apart from a 4-day bubble with one son and his family in August. I tell my patients, when in doubt about your COVID status, self-isolate. This virus strikes us one at a time as single organisms. Some of us have been living in another sort of bubble for a couple of generations, believing that our state of being, our personhood, is the essence of who we are. But nothing has popped this illusion more than seeing how we can infect each other with this virus. Like it or not, we are part of a larger community. There are those nearest and dearest to us, and those we don't care about or even know in this community. The well-being of one affects the well-being of all. How do we weigh the value of the community in relation to the value of the individual in this pandemic? And which community do we count? Our neighborhood? Our city? Many of my patients from Peru and Ecuador and Nicaragua were already sending money home to families in dire need before the pandemic hit. Carlos thought life not worth living if the hope of survival meant separation from his family. In hospital, he would have been looked after by caring professionals, but they had no history together. He knew whereof he spoke, being beside his wife for the previous 16 grueling months in the company of their children and grandchildren. I struggle with this dichotomy, the weighing of the community against the individual. It is not something you can put into an algorithm. My son has lost his way, was how Louisa put it. Her words brought to my mind the parable of the lost sheep told by Jesus in the Christian tradition. What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? I think this is the paradigm for our age. So many people have gotten lost during COVID. Surely there is a way to safeguard the flock and preserve the one. Save the herd, if you will, and bring back the one who got lost. Find a way for the frail elderly to have their family members help bath and feed them. An elderly woman who speaks no English and is cognitively impaired was admitted with kidney failure to the ICU. For 3 weeks, she had no meaningful contact with anyone she could understand. Her son was relieved to bring her home, reassured by staff that she was better and that her skin was intact. There was in fact a stage 3 wound on her sacrum, and it took 3 months to heal. Had he and his sister been at her side, they would have fed, cleaned, and turned her day and night. We must find a way for the 87-year-old woman admitted with COVID on one floor to say goodbye to her husband, who died of COVID on another floor. Yes, the isolation prevents spread of the virus and saves lives today, but will that wife spend her remaining time on Earth grieving for not being with her partner? And will the family members, also shut out, become depressed, develop stress-related illnesses from not doing what they believed was their filial duty? There are the wounds we see, but there are also moral wounds when we cannot do the good we must, or are forced to do what we believe is wrong. And we must find a way for Ethel to have quinoa cooked just the way she needs it while in hospital so she can recover. But I'll tell you who are the most lost in our society in this pandemic. Those who are addicted to drugs. Not ready to quit, pre-contemplative we call it, their supply cut off by the lockdown, too afraid of COVID to use with a buddy In the pangs of withdrawal, they ingest or inject drugs that are contaminated, all alone. I'm part of an interprofessional team providing medical care in 2 Toronto community housing buildings in Scarborough, populated by those who have recently been on the street or in shelters. In the first 2 months of the lockdown, we lost 8 women and men to suspected opioid overdoses. Nobody died of COVID. Addiction is a complicated human problem which has become an emergency. It is beyond prevention, though prevention must happen. Right now, rescue needs to happen. Those 8 are a statistic to me, to you, if we do not have a relationship with them. But they are like Luis's Jose, like Marcy's Tom, a son, brother, grandson whose life hangs in the balance. In my experience working with addictions severe enough for them to lose jobs and housing, pretty well all of them have experienced severe trauma, either as a child or as an adult. This is what can happen to the ones who are torn from their families, as in the residential school system in Canada, or the 60s scoop, or suffer beatings or sexual abuse within their families, or witness the horrors of war as a civilian or a soldier. And the harmful effects go on for generations. But now opioid addicts are dying alone in apartments and stairwells. In BC, from March to August, there were more than 100 deaths per month from illicit drug toxicity. By October, 1,200 people had died of fatal overdoses since January. What protects the herd endangers the one who is lost. Our harm reduction workers had to get out a subversive message to the users in our buildings. Don't use alone. That's more dangerous than getting COVID. In this pandemic, in every country of the world, we have to go after the ones who get lost. We have to look around and figure out who they are and how to bring them back to safety. From infants to the aged, those isolated with abusive partners, those too terrified to leave their homes, those without homes too terrified to use shelters, those desperate enough to use toxic drugs alone. The list goes on. As you can see, I have questions, not answers. I can see what needs to change, but I'm not sure how. I'm hoping our collective experience, built on that of our patients, can show us the way through this pandemic to a more equitable and compassionate future. Thank you.
Dr. Jane, thank you very much. You've spoken from a place of understanding patients' pain with care and kindness, to inviting us all to see that looking after the one and looking after community have to happen simultaneously. And your care as a physician means the people who are being seen by you are being seen in the way that we hope all medicine is being practiced. Thank you for inspiring us today and also calling us to use this time of this invisible microscopic virus as a way to look at our world differently and look at what each of us can do alone, but more importantly, collectively. Wherever we are, we can be part of finding this moment of time to be drawn to something better. So thank you very, very much for speaking today, Jane. And I'm going to hand us over to Zoe, who's going to invite those who have questions to be shared.
We have one comment from Shimona, who actually wrote a narrative chapter in our book Complications. And she has a comment regarding some really positive recent improvements in Bangladesh since Dr. Pritchard's time there. I will read you her comment now. I would like to mention that Bangladesh has come a long way from those days when only the breadwinner had footwear. Our economic success and empowerment of women are much talked about now. We also managed the COVID-19 pandemic quite well, with 165 million population and less than 6,000 deaths. It was remarkable. Thank you very much, Dr. Pritchard, for sharing. And over the next little while, if anybody has other comments or questions for Dr. Pritchard, feel free to put them in and we'll get to them. Thank you.
We have something that is a creation in the works that is going to be described, and we are invited to consider and perhaps get involved with. Bob Parke is a member of the board of the deVeber Institute, and he is a bioethicist. He worked and has since retired from the Humber River Regional Hospital, but is currently still working with Surrey Place, a special facility program in Toronto, which focuses on, I believe, both adults and children with intellectual disabilities. And this has merged with the desire to see good palliative care being provided for those for whom it hasn't been. So Bob Parke, we invite you to speak about improving palliative care for people with intellectual disorders. Thank you very much, Bob.
Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak with you. And I'm going to speak about a population that Dr. Pritchard just spoke about, who are quite vulnerable, those with intellectual disorders. And I'm hoping that my slides will advance as I'm hoping that I want them to. And so far, so good. I'm just digesting somewhat of what Dr. Pritchard had said, so I may have some thoughts or questions a little bit later, but I highly, highly value the work that you've been doing, Dr. Pritchard. Thank you for that. Because I've always been mindful in our healthcare practices that we have to watch out for those who have special needs, those who are vulnerable. What I want to do this evening is share with you a little bit about some work that we've begun doing in regards to improving the care for people who have intellectual disabilities. And I want to start with sharing with you some documents and some work that I had done through when I was appointed to the Ontario Palliative Care Network, which was a real privilege for me. And I was appointed to the Clinical Advisory Committee. And there are a few things that we did on that committee, and one of which I was on the Education Committee. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see Ontario Palliative Care Competency Framework. It was published April 2019. And we did some good foundational work in terms of identifying what are the competencies for people for whom palliative care is their practice and for whom palliative care is part of their practice. And those competencies range everybody from physicians to volunteers to chaplains, social workers, paramedics, PSWs, etc. There was something written there in terms of addressing palliative care competency. Certainly our goal was to try to improve palliative care for the province of Ontario. And I think we heard it earlier, by the way. I think Zoe, you mentioned it. There was some discussion about how, you know, there's richness in palliative care in some parts of Ontario, and there's very few resources in other parts of the province. And it's not always about being rural. Some rural parts of the province may have good palliative care, and some parts of even our own city don't have the same support. Now, what was striking to myself and a colleague, her name is Tracy Human, and Tracy Human is, she's a nurse and she does work that goes out, palliative care consultations, and goes out into the community, particularly into long-term care homes and into group homes. But what struck us in our work is nothing was said about people with disabilities, and in particular those with intellectual disabilities. And it was interesting, it was almost the silence in the documents that was actually what hit me more than what was said. And therefore we thought we ought to do something. We ought to work on a response. One of the things I wanted to draw our attention to is that perhaps you may think that the population of people with intellectual disabilities is relatively small, but one, they all need healthcare. And two, most of us who work in hospital settings have group homes or congregate living settings near our places of work, or they have long-term care homes near our places of work, and long-term care homes also accommodate people with intellectual disabilities. And there's a picture here that of Participation House, if you remember, during the first wave of COVID, had some problems with staff and residents getting COVID, and they're almost across the street from Markham Stillwell Hospital. But certainly we will have our people who come into our hospitals needing care. Now, we've done some very early work, and I would say we've had 3 meetings, and we brought people together who are situated in resources like RENA, like New Visions, like the Salvation Army Homes, Christian Horizons, who care for people in their settings, and also Toronto Community Living. And so these people have come together because we shared, and it was actually wonderful how easy it was to bring people together, because most of our colleagues and friends in this group recognized that there is a problem, that there is a gap in terms of our knowledge about palliative care for people with intellectual disabilities. One of the things that we would certainly like to do, and with Ontario Palliative Care Network, is we're reaching out to them. We're going to be having a meeting in December to see if we can use their ability to bring people from throughout the province into our work, because right now our work is largely Greater Toronto Area, and we need to expand into the province. Now, there were some themes or gaps that we identified in our early work that I wanted to share with you. One of those, I would say the major theme that was identified in our work, which is different than the general population in terms of the provision of palliative care services, is the need to bridge communications barriers. On the upper left, you can see a facsimile of something which we may call a pocket talker, and how many times we all have worked with people and have maybe in our own families, people who are hard of hearing. And there is anecdotal experience many of us have, but there's also empirical evidence that when people don't hear well, of course, they don't answer well, and therefore we as healthcare professionals may conclude that they're incapable, and then we end up turning to their substitute decision maker to make treatment decisions for them, when all we needed to do was to identify that they had a hearing problem and find ways to bridge that. A few years ago, I was doing an assessment with an occupational therapist, and we used a pocket talker with somebody who was profoundly hard of hearing. And it was a wonderful feeling afterwards when that dear woman said to us, "Thank you for caring." And we were able to engage her, have her participating in her care, and she felt her dignity and worth was there. Certainly other ways of engaging people in communication is using tablets. I should have actually put an image of a cell phone. Story that I know from one of the speech language pathologists that I worked with was of a woman who lost her tongue due to cancer, and she couldn't speak anymore, but she texted with her daughter. And the wonderful thing about that texting as a communications tool was it was not stigmatizing. You know, years ago, we may have had to go to an augmentative communications clinic, maybe spend a lot of money to get augmentative communications devices, which might have been large and clunky. Now with our cell phones, how wonderful that is to ease communications. And a shout out to Zoe, because Zoe knows this work about deaf-blind interpretation. And Zoe reminded me a couple of weeks ago when we had a brief conversation that it's important to realize that although people are living with this challenge, they are not incapable. Their minds are as good as ours, and therefore we need to find ways to communicate with people who are deafblind. And of course, we have an image here of different kinds of tablets or other tools that we can use to help communicate with people who are nonverbal for whatever the reason that they can't communicate. I wanted to share a little story with you, and this expression about behavior translation comes from Tracy Human. I give her credit for these words. And her story that she shares was about a young man who had an intellectual disability, had cancer, was living in a group home, and he was seen standing by the lampshade, and he was, how do you say it? Run his hands through the tassels that you see on the lampshade, and people were wondering, what is he doing? Well, what was found out was that when he was in pain, he would take his hands and go through those tassels on the lampshade because he found that soothing. And when he was in pain, he felt he needed to be soothed, and this is the way that he did it. And when somebody identified what his behavior was, then they were able to provide him with the medications he needed to address his pain. And in this particular circumstance, the pain management he needed was Tylenol, and that was helpful to him. And when he had Tylenol, he was able to return back to his sort of normal behaviors, or behaviors that were normal to him in his environment. So the need for behavior translation, that's one of the things that we identified as being important, that healthcare providers in hospitals and other settings should be aware of. Now, one of the tools that was created at Surrey Place, and I'm so grateful for my colleagues there and Dr. Bill Sullivan and others, and there's a website up here, for people who have to leave their homes, group homes who have an intellectual disability, this hospital transfer form provides information about how people communicate, what might trigger behaviors, who to call on to help them. And these can be used to help to smooth the transition if they have to come into the hospital and help in the triage setting. One of the things too that we've learned too from our work, and I've seen this myself from assessments I've done, is that many people living in group homes have been estranged from their families. And we had a fairly recent situation where the person was in a group home, but the family was called only in a time of crisis. And the difficulty was, of course, that the family didn't know their family member very well because they had been away from the family for some time. And oftentimes the group home staff were more like family. Sometimes we call them fictive family. Another thing that we found in terms of decision making was that people with intellectual disabilities are often under the care of a guardian. You know, in Ontario, we have the public guardian and trustee, and one of physicians I know, this is something he said to me just recently when we were talking about this, and the public guardian and trustees don't know the person and they have to make decisions for them. And one of the challenges too for us as healthcare professionals is in Ontario, we have this hierarchy of decision makers, and the law says that we have to defer to them. We have to identify the STM and defer to them in terms of decision making, but they may not know the person anymore, may not know how to work well with them. And if you don't know how to work well with somebody who has an intellectual disability, it may create a negative response. The person who was admitted to the hospital that I mentioned, because of COVID, they weren't allowed their specialized worker with them. And when staff went to do diagnostics and assessments, it triggered bad behaviors. And those bad behaviors, of course, were something that prejudiced the future care that person was getting. You know, oh, this is a person with behavioral problems. However, thank goodness for some advocacy, and we were able to get the person who knew how best to work with that patient with intellectual disability to be able to have time in the hospital. Wanted to share with you another thing too in terms of decision making, that it is important that we look at how can we engage people in decision making, and there's some pretty serious and good work being done on the areas of supported decision making. And certainly in the Iris Institute in Toronto, it's worth looking at that if you're interested in supported decision making. There's some work done in Western Australia on supported decision maker, but I'd like you to take a look at some point in the future if you have time. But this first image on the left side here says, assume I can. And then I think that's the first thing that we have to do. Don't assume that simply because somebody has an intellectual disability that they can't participate in decision making. We may have to find different ways of getting the right people involved and in the right place, and explore different ways of communicating with them. A story I know from a person who had a physical and intellectual disability who lives in Ottawa. Finally, he got upset with people for making decisions for him. And one day he said, can I please choose the topping on my pizza? And so if he could say that, what more if we could work with him to find ways to engage him in treatment decisions that he would have to make. I just have a couple more slides and then we'll almost be finished. One of the other areas that we identified is in our early work is challenges related to illness trajectory. And one of those challenges as compared to the general population, you take somebody who has Down syndrome and who may experience dementia, and they may experience dementia before those of us who become seniors, and they may not be eligible for a geriatric assessment because they're not seniors. And people with Down syndrome may experience heart failure and other issues differently than the general population. So therefore, these are some things we have to look at. How can we help general practitioners, hospital staff to identify best practices in regards to people with intellectual disabilities? The other thing that we identified in terms of medications and medication usage was oftentimes, or too often, medications are being given in response to behaviors, not in response to symptoms. Lastly, the other area that we're working through and considering is how can we help provide care for people in their homes? This is one of the goals of the Ontario Palliative Care Network for the general population, is to try to avoid hospitalizations unless necessary, and sometimes they are. But with the population of people with intellectual disabilities, how can we help them stay in their homes, even if they are group homes, and die within those places and provide the best care possible? The other thing that we want to look at is how can we ensure that the resources and knowledge is there for people who work in palliative care settings, hospices, palliative care units, so that they would, if they are admitting somebody with an intellectual disability, they would know how best to care for them and give them a dignified and meaningful experience until their life comes to its natural conclusion. I hope I didn't go over too much, but I wanted to thank you for listening to my presentation. And I certainly welcome any of you to, my email contact is there. Any of you have interest in this work and want to see what we can do to improve care, I would welcome your emails and perhaps engaging with us at a future point. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Zoe and all.
Thank you very, very much, Bob Parke. This is a very exciting initiative, and you've touched on so many different ways in which we can all consider how communication can be better, and also how we continue to have so many opportunities to improve care for everyone. And this is just one way in which people are coming together to improve care for adults with intellectual disabilities. And it's inspiring. Thank you very, very much. And I bet you're looking for some help to be involved. And I do want to just invite everybody at this moment, if you have a question for Dr. Jane Pritchard or for Bob Parke, please type it in right now. We'll just keep talking for a little while, but give you that opportunity, knowing that if you have a question later, there will be several ways in which you can get in touch with the Institute and have your questions answered by Dr. Jane or by Bob or Brianna or Catherine Mathe or Zoe about the research and everything that you've heard today. So
Bob, does OPCN have guidelines to help palliative care professionals to work with people with a developmental disability?
Sorry, I thought that I had answered that, but maybe we got a little technical glitch there. Again, thank you for the question. The answer is simple, no, not at present. That is why we're doing this work, to try to augment the work that's been done already in terms of palliative care for the general population. And so we have to bring together evidence from around the world, from Britain, from Europe, where they are doing some work and to try to improve the care of people with intellectual disabilities, palliative care for people. So not yet.
I have a second question for you, Bob. When dealing with patients with dementia, music can be a way of communicating with those individuals. Do you think it is wrong doing so working in an organization if you do not have consent from the organization that the patient is living in, but was given the information from a family member?
Ooh, that's interesting. Actually, it's rather a benign thing to provide music. And in many ways, when you think about, sometimes we may medicate people because of behavioral challenges and to try to get them either to do something or not do something. And music can be very good in many ways, in either helping to relax people who are upset about things or motivating them to do things. So I don't think that there should be need for consent. I think the challenge where it's good to have families involved when it comes to music, and if I'm understanding the question right, is to find what music the person likes. Because if you were to put hard rock on my headphones, I don't think I would enjoy that. So that would be where I'd have the point of being upset. But what would be helpful to the person?
Thank you very much for your answers, Bob and Dr. Pritchard. We're now going to go back to Martha to close us out for the evening.
We deeply appreciate that you spent your evening with us tonight. Thank you very, very much for your attention and obviously for your care. And during this whole time of COVID-19, I think it is important to know and to be encouraged that the rallying cry that everyone understood very clearly was, we want to save lives, and especially we want to be sure we look after the vulnerable. Have we always known how to do that? Have we always been doing it right? No. But the place that we begin from has been a place of empathy and a sense of responsibility to each and every person in the community, locally, nationally, and internationally. This is a good place to be at. And we hope that these talks tonight will motivate each and every one of us to work in whatever ways are available to us to enhance this respect for life. So be well, take care, and do stay in touch with the deVeber Institute. And if anyone would like to volunteer with the deVeber Institute, we are a small organization who would really welcome your involvement. So be well, thank you, good night.